All right, so anyone who's even looked at military strategy, even just for fun, there's this name that pops up over and over. Carl von Clausewitz.
Oh, absolutely. A giant in the field. Yeah, you can't escape him. And his main work on war, even though it's from the 19th century, it's still studied by, military minds all over the world today.
It's incredible. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. In this deep dive, we're going to be looking at Chapter 18 of Book 5, Command of Ground. And I think anyone listening who's actually, served this is going to resonate.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at first glance, command of ground, it sounds obvious, right? Higher ground, you get a better view. Simple. But Clausewitz, being Clausewitz, he challenges us to think a little bit deeper, dig a little deeper.
Oh, he does. He really does. He's basically saying, don't be seduced by what you think is a commanding position. Like he even uses this very stark phrase, talking about a hollow shell.
Yeah, he loves that vivid imagery. He's getting at, don't put too much stock in terrain all by itself. Like, just because you've got a hill or a forest or a river doesn't mean you've automatically won. They're just features, not guarantees.
So command of ground isn't some magic bullet. So what advantages does Clausewitz actually see in holding higher ground? Because there has to be something, right?
Oh, for sure. He lays out 3 main advantages, and these, depending on how they play out, can be totally different based on the context. So advantage number 1, he talks about tactical strength. So picture this, a 19th century battlefield. Muskets, cannons, limited range, right? If you're on higher ground, your weapons, boom, instantly have greater reach, greater impact.
Yeah, imagine being on the other side, trying to advance uphill while under fire. Brutal.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Okay.
the second advantage. Difficulty of approach. Any natural barrier, whether it's a steep slope, a thick forest, having to cross a river, all of a sudden the enemy can't move as easily. It's much harder to attack effectively.
Well, yeah. Obstacles, whether they're natural or man-made, that's classic warfare 101, right?
Exactly. And then there's one that just makes sense, right? Better view. Command of view is how he puts it. Back then, before radar, before drones, satellite imagery, being able to see what the enemy was doing because you were higher up, crucial.
You're not just reacting, you're observing, thinking ahead, maybe even dictating the pace of the entire battle.
Exactly. But here's where Clausewitz gets really interesting. He doesn't just say, here's 3 advantages, end of story. He then breaks down how they might work differently if you're on the offensive versus being on the defensive.
Okay, so we've got these 3 advantages: tactical strength, hard to approach, and being able to see better. But when the fighting actually starts, how do those actually play out? I mean, is holding the high ground always the best move no matter what you're trying to do?
Well, that's what's so cool. Clausewitz, he separates those first 2, the tactical strength and difficulty of approach, and says they mainly help out the defender.
Really? Why is that? Seems like those would be good no matter what side you're on.
Think about it. If you're attacking, always moving, the second you advance, those advantages, they're gone. Can't take a hill with you, right? And that forest that was helping you, now it's a death trap if the enemy knows you're in it.
Huh, yeah. Like the terrain can help you or hurt you depending.
Totally. But that third one, command of view. Now that gets really interesting for an attacker. Clausewitz, he says, knowing the terrain really well, because you can see it all, that's huge for a strategic offensive.
So even if I'm the one attacking, if I know the land, where the enemy's strong, where they're weak, that helps me plan my attack.
Exactly. Don't forget, a good offense isn't just charging in blindly. It's about picking your spots, knowing when to strike. Sometimes that even means, getting defensive for a bit, holding a spot, getting your troops ready.
Like sometimes you got to take a step back to take 2 steps forward, right?
Exactly. And in those moments, switching between attack and defense, that's when being able to see everything is super important. But Clausewitz also says, even with all that, geography is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, because he's famous for saying terrain alone doesn't win wars.
Exactly. He's got this other line. He says, victory comes down to the number and value of victorious combats.
Okay, that got to break that down for me. What's that mean?
Basically, it all comes down to winning those little battles, those clashes. And how do you win those? Well, that depends on a lot: how good your soldiers are, how good your leaders are, and maybe most importantly, how well you can adapt when things change. Because let's face it, in war, nothing ever goes exactly to plan.
So even if I've got the high ground, I need well-trained troops, smart commanders, and I got to be able to think on my feet. Because, yeah, in war, things rarely go as planned.
You got it. And don't forget, Clausewitz, he was writing after the Napoleonic Wars, right? He saw firsthand how Napoleon, brilliant military mind, he could actually overcome some pretty serious geographic disadvantages just because he was that good and his troops were that good.
Are there any battles that really show this, where the terrain played a big part, but it didn't decide who won or lost in the end? It really makes you think, right? Like, warfare has changed so much, even since Clausewitz was writing. I mean, how do we take these ideas like command of ground and make them work in a world with, like, fighter jets, long-range missiles, cyber attacks? It's a whole different game now.
That's the million-dollar question, right? How do we take these principles that have been around forever and apply them to a world that Clausewitz he couldn't even imagine? But honestly, I think he'd be the first one to say, keep thinking, keep questioning. He doesn't want us to just blindly follow old rules. He wants us to think for ourselves.
So are we saying Clausewitz is irrelevant now? Like, should we just toss him out with the muskets and all that?
No way. People still study him for a reason, right? It's about taking those core ideas, those things about war that never really change, and figuring out how they work now.
Okay, so for example, how has air power, how's that changed things when we're talking about command of ground?
Okay, so think back to those natural barriers we were talking about. Mountains, rivers, thick forests. For like forever, those things, they were huge in war. Obstacles and opportunities all in one, right? Air power, that changes everything. A mountain range that might take you days to cross, now you fly over it in minutes. Got a fort that looks totally safe from the ground. Airstrike, boom, it's vulnerable.
So high ground, that means something totally different now, right? It's not just about who's higher up on the land anymore. It's about who controls the skies.
100%. And then you've got cyber warfare. Clausewitz, he never even had to think about that. But command of you in the digital world, man, that takes on a whole new meaning. It's not just what you can see with your own eyes. It's about who controls information.
So we're talking satellites, drones, all the listening and watching. You know, having that complete picture, even if you're not physically standing on a hilltop.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, that control of information, it can totally change who has the advantage in ways Clausewitz he could have only dreamed about. Like, imagine a cyber attack that shuts down communications, screws up supplies, creates total chaos, and you haven't even fired a shot yet.
It makes you think about that phrase Clausewitz uses about the number and value of victorious combats. What does that even mean when you can win or lose a battle online with real consequences, but nobody's even set foot on a traditional battlefield?
Huge question. Makes you wonder, do we even need a new definition of combat itself to include all these new ways of fighting wars, where winning or losing matters just as much, even if it doesn't happen on a map like we used to think about?
It's really mind-blowing. It's like Clausewitz is still making us think all these years later about how war is changing. Like, he's saying, don't get stuck in the old ways of thinking.
Exactly. He gives us the tools to analyze conflict, but he's also saying, hey, war, it never stays the same. It's up to you to keep up.
So to wrap up this deep dive into command of ground, I think the biggest takeaway, especially for those of you out there, on the front lines, is this. Don't be fooled by appearances. Remember what Clausewitz said about those hollow shells. Real command, no matter what year it is, it comes from understanding how the land, technology, and people all work together. It's about your troops, your plans, and never giving up.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And one last thing to think about. As technology just gets more and more advanced, how will we have to update our thinking about command of ground? Artificial intelligence, killer robots, the whole world being connected. What does that all mean for how we fight wars? These are the questions that Clausewitz, even though he's long gone, he's still pushing us to figure out.
Questions that matter more now than ever. So until our next deep dive, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.